Welcome everybody to London Futurists podcast. This is the very first episode and I am co-host David Wood, joined by
Calum Chace,
also co-host, and we'll say a little bit more about ourselves in a moment. But to start with, why are we launching this podcast? In 2 words, it's exponential impact. That's a bit short, let's give it 5 words. Anticipating and managing exponential impact. That's impact which is more than what you would expect just by a naive extrapolation of past trends. So we're trying to share what we have learned over years, decades, interacting with a whole bunch of futurists, technologists, forecasters, numerous other people. We think we have developed some skills at what we can call exponential foresight, which is different and goes beyond mere linear foresight. So we want to help share these skills with the community. We recognize that this kind of foresight isn't something any individual can do very well by themselves, but together we can do it better. So we will be seeking to grow a community of collaborative exponential foresight, exploring things like how can we get better at distinguishing scenarios that are weird but actually turn out to be plausible, and other scenarios which frankly are just science fiction, Hollywood, dystopian fantasies with very little basis in reality. And as well as looking at how can we improve assessing the credibility of scenarios, we'll look at how do we assess the desirability of scenarios, the ones that turn out to be nothing like as attractive as a first impression might suggest, and the other ones which maybe give us an initial shudder, but when we think about it, we realize could actually be a very good place for humanity to go. So that's what I'm hoping to get out of these episodes.
I have spent the last 10 years intensively, and quite a few decades before that, on and off, thinking about the amazing changes that are coming in the next few decades. And I don't think enough people are aware of just how profound these changes are going to be. One of the things I'm very excited about doing this podcast is that, David, you've been thinking about these things for just as long, and I think in the process of discussing with you, I'm going to learn a great deal. The big meme which is out there about what we're going through by way of technological societal change is that we're in the 4th industrial revolution. And I think this is profoundly misleading. I don't think we're in some subset of the industrial revolution. I think we're in a whole new revolution which started around about actually the time that you and I were born, David, in the late 50s, early 60s. And it's the information revolution. And I think this will have a much bigger impact than any of the previous revolutions that humanity has gone through. In fact, I think it's probably either the 5th or the 6th. There was fire, the taming of fire. There was the cognitive revolution when we acquired language and were able to collaborate better. There was the agricultural revolution. Then there was the industrial revolution. Now there's the information revolution. And this will, I think, have a bigger impact on humanity than any of the previous ones. There's a very nice saying, I don't know who first coined it, that change has never before been so fast and it will never again be so slow. And one of the most controversial things that I think is that this is the best time ever to be a human being. And it's also the most interesting and the most important time. And I think that summarizes for me a lot of what this is all about. One of the sad things is that, of course, trying to forecast what's going to happen is really hard because, as many people have observed, we tend to overestimate the impact in the short term and underestimate the impact in the long term. And unfortunately, we just don't know how long the short term and the long term are. This is known as Amara's Law, and it's been mentioned by many people like Arthur C. Clarke and Bill Gates. And I think one of the things that distinguishes this podcast, David, is that we're interested in the 10 years plus time frame, even more than the immediate future. There's a lot of people talking about what's going to happen in the next few years, and that is the planning horizon for businesses and for most individuals, so that's fair enough. But it's in the medium and long term, 10 years to 50 years and beyond, that the exponential difference really kicks in. And I think that's probably a distinguishing feature of this podcast.
So we take seriously what Google CEO Sundar Pichai said a year or two back, that artificial intelligence is the technology that will change the world as much as any other, probably more than electricity, and probably even more than fire. And he was widely criticized for being out of touch and head in the sky and whatever. But I think he's right. I think AI, as it develops, and in combination with nanotechnology, quantum computing, and our ability to apply these technologies to the reprogramming of our biology and the reprogramming of our brains, all of that is going to change humanity in a remarkably profound way, which exceeds what's happened in the past. And that deserves to be discussed. And it may not happen in the next year or two, but the odds are strong that within a few decades, within 20 years at the most, I would say, these technologies will have turned almost everything that we know upside down. And it could be upside down in a wonderful way, liberating us from all kinds of drawbacks, such as our short-sightedness, our emotional spasms from time to time, our ways that we abuse power, and the fact that our bodies break down over time and we become prone to more diseases. All of these drawbacks could be things of the past if we can apply the fruits of AI wisely. So indeed, it is incredibly interesting times. But there's nothing preordained about this. And when we talk about exponential impact, I think that's true as a first approximation, but when we look more closely at these curves, we often see extended periods of slowdown and disappointment before things really do take off. You mentioned Calum Amara's law. I may give you, in contrast, Demi Moore's law, which I first came across, it turns out, I did some research before this meeting, and I first came across it in a book I read in 2003. And it was first featured in the Financial Times a few years before by a monitor consultant called Bhaskar Chakravorty. And the Demi in this Demi Moore's law applies to things taking twice as long as you might expect from a naive extrapolation of exponential trends. In other words, that things are going half as fast, Demi as fast. And the reason things take a long time isn't just because technology is hard, it's because the changes require multiple things to happen in parallel. So electric cars, well, you need electric cars, of course, you need improved batteries, but you also need improved network of charging stations and all that goes with it. For mobile phones, industry I know very well, before there was wide takeoff of mobile phones, you needed the phones, you also needed networks, the GSM, 2G initially, and you also needed a network of retailers such as Carphone Warehouse who understood how to sell these devices. And if we go up a level from normal mobile phones to smart mobile phones, you need the smart devices with extra capability. You also needed smarter networks. You also needed applications. And you needed application stores where people could find and purchase applications. You needed a network of application developers, and you needed systems to support these application developers. And in each case, the investment decision to grow that was hard because you would think you might be ahead of the market demand. So all these things needed to come into place, which meant that smartphones took longer to come into being than might have been expected. But then once the ecosystem was formed, it accelerated. And so pace changed from going at half what you might have expected to double or more quickly than expected. And that's the kinds of things that I look forward to exploring with you, Calum, in future episodes here.
Smartphones are a really interesting case study. They illustrate a number of things really well. One of them is how hard it is to forecast what's going to happen, but how obvious it seems in hindsight. When we were younger, telephones were devices the size of a small dog. They sat on a table and they were tethered to the wall by a wire, and they were slightly terrifying because they were so expensive to use. And I'm pretty sure that when I was young, not very many people were forecasting that within our lifetimes we would have supercomputers in our pockets, housed in phones. But in hindsight, it's really obvious that that is the way it should have gone, because what humans are above all else is social animals. We became the apex predator on the planet because we were able to talk to each other in sophisticated ways and agree how we would take that mammoth down. and we would agree how to stop that tiger killing us. And so it's natural that our most powerful technology, which is the supercomputers that we carry around, the most powerful technologies most of us have day-to-day access to, would be in a device which is nominally a communications device, even though most of us use it quite rarely as a phone these days. So it's a nice illustration of that. And going back to your Demi Moore joke, which I like, another example of how long things take and why they take so long. Engineers have a saying that the first 99% of any really long project takes the first 99% of the time available. The last 1% takes the second 99% of the time available. And the reason for that is partly that things that are complicated and worth doing are usually much harder than people think, and that's clearly true of things like self-driving cars. But it's also partly because technology can't just be released on an uncaring, unsuspecting world and then roll out on its own. It has to be adopted. And in order to be adopted, it has to some extent be understood. And humans take quite a while to do that. And our institutions take a while to wrap themselves around new technologies. So there's an adoption lag as well as a kind of an engineering development lag. And I think that's probably the reason why Amara's law is in place, is why it works.
As a software engineer, I would say that it isn't always necessary for the last 1% to take as long as the first 99%. Some of that delay at the final hurdle is often attributed to bad planning earlier in the project. People have been rushing all the way through. They haven't been paying attention to sufficient testing and quality and integration and good architecture. And if you skimp earlier on in the project, things will last longer. So as a software engineering manager for many decades, I would say it doesn't have to be quite as bad as that. But I do take your point that there often needs to be changes in the attitudes and expectations of users for the true potential of a product to be understood and developed. And again, smartphones or even normal mobile phones fit that category. Back in the 1980s, when people were doing exploration of what might be possible, Marty Cooper had demonstrated a mobile phone in New York, Times Square, sometime in the 1970s. Other people had done experiments. Nokia had released a car phone, in a sense, rather than a phone, in the early 1980s. AT&T, which at the time dominated fixed wire telephone infrastructure, they were smart enough to hire clever guys from McKinsey to explore how big an impact on their current market would these newfangled mobile phones likely have. And they said, let's look ahead to the year 2000. So the McKinsey consultants came back and said it might almost reach 1 million users by the year 2000. And they had extrapolated and they had assumed that battery life would get a bit better, that the phones would get a bit lighter, and the voice quality would improve a bit. They did not anticipate how once things had started to improve and there were self-improving cycles, there were standards established where different companies could innovate and compete. Once users had got a liking for mobile phones and suddenly realized actually it would be good if they could keep in touch whilst on a shopping trip with your better half and you could figure out where he or she was rather than dejectedly looking at your shoes and so on. So people realized without expecting beforehand that these devices were useful, and none of that was properly anticipated by McKinsey. And their estimate for the size of the market by 2000 was short by 3 orders of magnitude if we look at the global market, or 2 orders of magnitude if we're generous and just look at the US market. And what happened to AT&T? You may say, well, they're still here, but in fact, it's a very different company. The original AT&T basically went out of business, and other descendants of the Bell company took on that name in due course. So it was a terrible forecasting mistake. But it's the same, I think, with things like rejuvenation technologies. If you ask people today, would you like to be fit and healthy till the age of 200? Most people will look away embarrassed and say, no, not me. I wouldn't want that. In the same way that if you'd asked people in the 1980s, would you like to have a powerful smartphone in your pocket? They would have said, I can't imagine any purpose for that. But as people do see others who are older than them apparently looking healthier and fresher as they see their pet cats and dogs rejuvenated in middle age and gaining a new lease of life, that expectation is going to change. And it will be like smartphones, I predict. It will move from a slow phase of awkwardness and disappointment and not much happening into a fast and furious phase.
Yeah, yeah. Peter Thiel famously complained that we were promised jetpacks and what we got was 180 characters. Was it 140? By which he meant Twitter. And I've always thought that was a bit of a daft observation because, okay, we didn't get jetpacks, although there are some people who've got jetpacks. But what we did get was omniscience, or something pretty close to it, thanks to smartphones and Wikipedia and Google search, which is, I think, something that would have been much more amazing to a Victorian than a jetpack. If you said to a Victorian, which would surprise you most, to be able to fly around with a power pack on your back, or to be able to know anything that any human has known by tapping a couple of buttons on something in your pocket, I'm sure they would have been more surprised by omniscience. So the changes that are coming are going to be even more astonishing than the changes that have happened, even though those changes are pretty amazing. And not enough people are paying attention. Not enough people realize that much greater longevity is not only possible, it's likely within the next few decades, and that this is going to change everything about the nature of being human. When it becomes apparent that you can live to 200 and possibly 300 and beyond, that will change the way we look at life enormously. We probably want to have a conversation in another podcast later about the word singularity, but I think it's not unreasonable to talk about a longevity singularity coming because of the nature of that change in perceptions. And this is what I hope we get across in these podcasts, is the scale of what's coming and how important it is to think about them wisely. And the further ahead you start thinking about them, the easier it is to think about them wisely. We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
One point I also want to emphasize is that the technology by itself does not determine the outcome. Although I'm a great fan of what technology can do, I don't believe that it's simply a matter of sitting back and cheering from the sidelines. Each kind of technology can lead in disastrous directions as well as in beneficial directions. Social media, which has the potential to spread information, also has the potential to spread disinformation. And in fact, it does spread disinformation, and it spreads division, distrust, emotional hostility, and so forth. It will be the same almost with every other piece of technology. Technology that researches viruses to try to anticipate how viruses might mutate and how we could be ready with vaccines ahead of time has the potential, if mismanaged, to leak out into dangerous viruses that are leaking from labs or maybe being copied by disturbed people who have their own reasons to release them. So we needed to replace a sense of technological determinism with a sense of human determinism, by thinking about the possibilities, thinking about the dangerous possibilities as well, not because we are doomsmongers, but because we think it's wise to be forewarned. Just as when you get on an aeroplane, it's wise to know where the safety jacket is. It's wise to know where to look in case there's a crash, that you will look on the floor to see the lighting guiding you to the exit points. It's wise to know about the whistle and so forth. So we need to be aware of the potential things that can go wrong. And we need to be aware also of the tremendously exciting ways things could go well if we see them and if we pool together with a specific sense of collaboration and vision.
Technology is always a double-edged sword. I doubt whether there's ever been a really influential technology which hasn't had downsides as well as upsides. I suppose our very first technology was fire, and when humans discovered how to tame fire, how to control it and use it, that enabled them to live on the ground rather than living up in trees, hiding from leopards and tigers, and enabled them to become bipedal, which enabled them to run after animals and become long-distance runners, so they could chase animals and wear them out. It enabled us to cook food, and that enabled us to absorb energy in a very efficient way, and that enabled us to grow these very expensive things we have inside, very energy expensive things we have inside our heads called brains, and propelled us to being clear masters of the planet. Some people might regret that, but I think it's a good thing. And so fire is something that's given us amazing benefits, but it can burn your house down and it can kill you. So technology is always a double-edged sword. Generally, its upsides are much better than its downsides. I think one of the few areas that you and I might disagree, David, is I'm not convinced by the very common point of view that social media is responsible for a lot of the spread of poison in our culture. I remember the days before social media when people got their information from newspapers, and typically you either read The Sun or you read The Mirror. You either read The Guardian or you read The Times. You didn't see the other person's point of view. On social media, most people, even if they deride it and hate it, they do see the other person's point of view. And I'm pretty certain myself that Rupert Murdoch is much more to do with the spreading of poisonous ideas than Facebook or YouTube. And I think there's academic work that demonstrates that. But anyway, technology is always a double-edged sword, and the future technologies will be double-edged swords. And the more powerful technologies get, and as time goes on they are getting more powerful, that means the more dangerous the downsides are. I suspect, and this is something that we can probably explore in the coming episodes, that there is a kind of technological determinism. Technology will have a way that, as Kevin Kelly said, it wants something. It wants to develop in a particular way. It tends to develop in a particular way. And it's a bit binary. Either we find a way to accommodate ourselves to it and make good use of that, or we screw it up, or it screws us up, and then we just get blown off course and have to sort of circuitously go round until we get back onto that course. But I'm very much open to being persuaded that there are a million different ways we could go, and that it's not at all deterministic. I suspect it is, but maybe somebody will come along during one of these episodes and demonstrate that it's not.
One thing I like to say is that better foresight grows in part out of better hindsight. That as well as thinking about the future, we should be aware of what happened in the past, and sometimes we are misled by the simple linear stories. When I say linear, I mean one-track stories. There might be an acceleration of pace in them, but it seems to say, well, this happened, therefore it was all bound to happen. And it is fascinating, in my view, to look back at possible pivot points when things could have turned out very differently. And I think that's a lesson for how the future may turn out differently. But as you say, Calum, we have many episodes ahead in which we can explore these points, in part by looking at whatever's in the news at the time we record the episodes, and looking back at historical context, and then looking forward with what I would call exponential foresight as to, well, this means this in the next few months, but it could have this implication for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
And I think that's a good moment for us to briefly introduce ourselves.
I've spent, since 2008, 14 years running London Futurists, which is an informal meetup where people have regular conversations from multiple points of view about the possible radical scenarios for the next 40 years. Before that, I spent more than 2 decades in the mobile computing and smartphone industry, where I was, in effect, a futurist, even though I didn't realize that to start off with, but I was very interested, along with my colleagues, in Scion and then in Symbian, and working in colleagues in companies that used our software, such as Nokia, Motorola, Samsung, Ericsson, and so forth. There were people in all these companies who were thinking about how technology would be different in a few years' time, and how architectures of hardware and software needed to be changed in order to cater for these differences. So I became a futurist then. I was officially head of research, and later I changed my job title to futurist. Going back further, I studied mathematics and then something called the philosophy of science, which may sound a bit arcane, but I think it's incredibly useful to be able to help distinguish what's good science, reliable science, from what we might nowadays call fake science, which is things that are presented with a scientific veneer, with some appearance of scientific language, but actually don't follow true scientific methods. So I draw on all these backgrounds when I do my foresight. Calum, you have a fascinatingly different but complementary history.
As a philosopher myself by training, I certainly don't think it's an arcane subject. I think it's a way of training you to think that's invaluable when you're trying to unravel the very complicated story that lies ahead of us. When I left university, I spent a brief time as a journalist, a trainee journalist at the BBC, and I've kept dipping back into journalism over the years. I had a column in the FT for a short while, but I spent about 30 years in business as a marketer, and then a long time as a strategy consultant, and a lot of my work there was helping companies deal with the web. As it arrived, it was apparent to lots of companies that it was going to really change their businesses, and they didn't know how. So I did a lot of work trying to unravel that story for various companies. And then I ended my career as a CEO of a small company. And I retired in 2011, and because I don't play golf, I spent a lot of time reading about something that I'd been increasingly fascinated by, which was artificial intelligence and its likely impact on the future. By that time, I'd read Ray Kurzweil and was very, very struck by his explanation of how significant the future impact of exponential growth was going to be. And so I started writing about AI and similar subjects, and my timing was perfect because I started in 2012. That was the year of the Big Bang, and people were eager for explanations that lay people could understand about AI. So my books did well, and I got asked to do talks, and so I spent a good few years as a keynote speaker until COVID came along and killed that business absolutely dead, and it's now gradually recovering. So that's what I am now, as a speaker and writer about AI.
And you write fiction as well as non-fiction.
Well, I do, although I've only written 2 novels, and I'm very slow at it. And I think I'm primarily a non-fiction writer, which is a source of regret, but I just don't invent stories quickly enough. I'm more of an explainer than a storyteller, really.
I enjoyed both your novels, but maybe it's the case that the non-fiction narratives that we'll explore in this show will inspire other people to weave fictional stories around them, because the world gets changed by people reading stories as well as by people thinking about hard facts.
Absolutely, and it'd be great if we do, and particularly if people can write uplifting stories. Stories typically need jeopardy, and Hollywood always tends to give us dystopias when they depict the future. Not always, but generally. And we need more positive stories about the future.
And what should we discuss in our next few episodes, Calum?
Well, I think we need to tackle artificial intelligence early on, just dive straight into that monster. But there's also a whole lot of fascinating subjects like longevity and agriculture, mixed reality, automation, self-driving cars. I think we should tackle the simulation hypothesis at some point. That'll be a lot of fun. There's a lot of ground to cover.
And it turns out, in my experience anyway, that a lot of these independent ideas turn out to be connected to each other. So that you think you can analyze these things in isolation, but it turns out if you're aware of something else happening, they often interact in unexpected ways. So we do need to spread attention to quite a number of different topics. We need to look at the technology, we need to look at the economics, the legal side, and the philosophy. And through all of that, I hope we'll improve the community's understanding and our own understanding, very importantly, of the possibilities that lie ahead.
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying, if this hasn't already come across, that our aspiration for these podcasts is that they would convey how excited we are about the future, but that we are trying to be realistic. And we've both got a lot of experience in making change happen within organizations and families and societies. So we know how hard it is for change to happen. But we are excited about the future, and we want to encourage other people to be excited.
because in just a few short decades, we could be living in profoundly wonderful circumstances, and everybody could be participating in the fruits of the abundance generated by next generation artificial intelligence. So let's paint that picture. Let's, by all means, criticize it, poke holes in it. Let's figure out which parts are truly credible and what we can do to be sure that nobody is left behind on this journey to that better future.
Absolutely. As Captain Picard says, let's make it so.
Let's make it so.